Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into the chill mist of a Flanders dawn, the kind where your boots sink with a faint squelch into something that was once dirt, but is now an unholy marriage of clay, rainwater, and the discarded dreams of the previous night's shelling. You're there, shivering under your greatcoat, the edges of your breath curling in front of you like tiny ghosts. Off to your left, there's the metallic clink of enamel mugs, the comforting rattle of a mess tin lid being pried open by fingers that have been numb since yesterday. Someone's found just enough fuel to coax a flame out of damp kindling, and soon a thin ribbon of steam begins to curl upward. It's tea time in the trenches, and you probably won't survive this without it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear from you. Post your location and your local time in the comments. It's always a joy to know who's drifting off with me from halfway across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your fingers curl around a chipped mug, the warmth seeping through your gloves, spreading like a secret down your wrists. It's astonishing how such a humble thing, a few leaves and hot water, can feel like the difference between a human being and a miserable lump of khaki cloth. The trench smells faintly of wet wool, cordite, and, now, that sharp tannic perfume that only British Army-issue tea seems to have. You sip, and the steam fogs your eyelashes. The taste is both bitter and strangely sweet, the sweetness coming from condensed milk that's been rattling around in a tin since some cheerful factory girl sealed it months ago in a far-off port town. A thin skim of oil floats on top, courtesy of the brewing process in a well-used mess tin. But you don't mind. Out here, you've learned that a touch of grime just means it's authentic. Somewhere behind you, a man mutters a joke about the tea being strong enough to strip the paint off the general's mustache. Laughter follows, low and tired but genuine. It's the kind of humor that keeps men upright when they'd rather fold in on themselves. Historians still argue whether these small rituals of comfort actually extended morale in measurable terms, or whether they were simply the human instinct to cling to something normal when the rest of the world had gone mad. The light changes slowly, the pale gray lifting enough to reveal the ragged duckboards that snake through the mud. You balance your mug on one, careful not to spill a drop, because you know the next chance to boil water might be hours or days away. Out on the parapet, a sentry sips his tea with one hand while his eyes scan no man's land. The juxtaposition is almost absurd. A man watching for movement in a killing field while drinking something more associated with polite drawing rooms than war. Steam continues to drift into the cold air, and you find yourself staring at it, letting your mind wander homeward. You remember your own kettle, the one that rattles just before it boils, and the blue-patterned china mug that's probably sitting in the cupboard, untouched since you left. You wonder if anyone's using it now, or if it's waiting for you, collecting dust like so many other things you've put on pause. Another shell bursts in the distance. Not close enough to make you flinch, but enough to send a tremor through the boards beneath your feet. Someone makes a half-hearted remark about how it's nothing to do with us, and conversation resumes. The tea warms your insides in a way food rarely can out here. It's not just heat, it's a reminder that for a few moments, you can pretend the world is sane. You drain the last drop, tilt the mug to get that final sweetness of milk and tannin, and wipe your mouth with the back of your glove. Around you, the ritual is winding down, mugs stacked, mess tins scraped clean, fires smothered. The day will demand more of you. More mud, more waiting, more sudden bursts of chaos. But for now, the morning has been marked in the most British way possible, with a good, if imperfect, cup of tea. And in the trenches, that's as close to peace as you'll get. You cradle that memory of warmth as the day in the trenches lurches forward, and your mind drifts, uninvited, back to the long, winding road that brought tea here in the first place. It's almost comical, when you think about it, that the same leaves which once perfumed the air of refined Victorian drawing rooms now steam gently over a soot-blackened brazier beside a sandbag wall. Britain's love affair with tea didn't start in a muddy dugout. It started centuries earlier, with porcelain cups and whispered fascination for a leaf from far-off China. By the late 19th century, tea was no longer an exotic luxury. It was an essential habit woven into the fabric of British life. You grew up with it. Your grandmother likely brewed it the proper way. Pot warmed first, leaves measured just so, milk added after pouring. But the empire had made sure tea wasn't just a drink. It was an identity. And identities, like stubborn old habits, travel everywhere their owners do, even into the killing fields of Europe. You can almost picture the British Expeditionary Force setting out for the Western Front, rifles slung over one shoulder and some form of tea kit wedged in their kit bag, as vital as spare socks. Officers knew what they were doing. Give a man his tea and he'll put up with the rain, the cold, and even the occasional bout of dysentery with a slightly better attitude. Historians still argue whether tea's role in the First World War was truly strategic or merely a cultural reflex. Was it about caffeine for alertness? Hydration in a place where water sources could be suspect? Or was it simply that the idea of being without tea was unthinkable for a Briton of the time? You suspect it's all three, tangled up in one steaming mug. You recall a letter home from a fellow soldier, read aloud one evening when the mail came in. "Tea," he'd written, "is the one thing that makes this all feel like a bad camping holiday instead of, well, you know." The "you know" was left hanging. Like most things, better not spelled out. And it wasn't just the British at this point. Colonial troops from India, Australia, and Canada also brought their own tea traditions to the lines. The flavors varied: strong Assam from Indian stores, earthy Ceylon, even rooibos from South Africa when it could be had. These mingled in a strange fraternity of taste, though each man swore his home brew was the only proper one. Back home, tea merchants leaned into the war effort. Adverts in newspapers claimed their blends were as hearty as Tommy himself, or keeping our boys sharp at the front. Some companies even contributed specially packaged soldier's tea, vacuum-sealed for freshness, and with a label proudly boasting it could withstand the dampest trench. You suspect those advertisers had never stood ankle-deep in Belgian mud, but you'll give them points for optimism. The cultural attachment was so strong that military planners made tea part of the official ration system. The War Office didn't mess about with luxuries. If it was in the ration book, it was considered vital. You can almost hear some stiff-lipped quartermaster saying, "A man without tea is a man with a grievance." And grievances, in war, can spread faster than trench foot. One of the more amusing side effects of this obsession was that British soldiers often tried to convert their allies. French troops were bemused, sipping politely, but clearly preferring their own coffee. Germans, when captured, sometimes remarked on the strange priority the British placed on brewing tea, even under bombardment. One German diary entry described it as a ritual of lunatics who insist on boiling water before shooting. You let your mind wander back to your own first cup, long before the war, when you were small enough to grip the mug with both hands. Back then it was served with too much milk and sugar, a treat rather than a necessity. Now, you take it strong, with just enough condensed milk to soften the edge, and you drink it less for pleasure than for the reassurance that you're still, somehow, part of a tradition older and sturdier than the trenches themselves. It's funny in that wry, not quite a joke way, that a nation's beverage of choice could become a psychological anchor for men surrounded by mud, wire, and death. But as you glance at the scorched mess tin, still warm from the morning's brew, you know it's true. Tea is more than just a drink here. It's the thread that ties you back to a world that hasn't forgotten you. And in a place where everything else can be taken away, that thread is worth holding on to. The morning seeps away into a dull, damp afternoon, and you find yourself staring at the small, blackened kettle resting on a makeshift shelf carved into the trench wall. It's empty now, but you know that by the time dusk settles in, someone will find a way to fill it again. Out here, making tea isn't just a matter of pouring water over leaves. It's an exercise in resourcefulness, stubbornness, and, at times, outright comedy. Because, let's face it, boiling water in the mud is not exactly straightforward. The trenches are not known for their abundance of clean, dry fuel. You've seen men coax flames out of half-damp wood scavenged from shattered barns, and you've seen them burn things that, frankly, you'd rather not identify just to get that water bubbling. Sometimes it's a proper brazier, sometimes it's a biscuit tin punched with holes to make a crude stove, and sometimes it's simply a small pile of glowing embers guarded like treasure from the wind. The first challenge is the water itself. Rainwater pools in every low spot. But it's got the color and clarity of oversteeped tea even before you add any leaves. Officially, you're meant to fill from designated water carts brought up from behind the lines. Unofficially, if you're desperate, you might skim off the cleaner layer from a shell crater and hope the boil will kill whatever was swimming in it. Historians still argue whether more soldiers fell ill from enemy fire or from their own water sources. You remember one particularly desperate evening when Private Collins swore blind he'd found a fresh stream just behind the trench. Turned out to be runoff from the cookhouse mixed with rain. But to his credit, once boiled and heavily doused with tea, it wasn't half bad. Or maybe your standards have shifted. Getting the heat right is another art form. Too little flame and you'll be waiting until the war ends. Too much and you scorch the bottom of your mess tin, lending a smoky bitterness that no amount of sugar can mask. Still, some men claimed to like that flavor, said it reminded them of bonfires at home. Fuel was so scarce that soldiers would sometimes time their brews with cooking sessions. If someone was heating bully beef or frying up bread scraps, you'd slip your tin alongside and hope to catch the heat. There was an unspoken etiquette. If your tin got hot enough to boil while you were using someone else's fire, you'd offer them the first cup. Small gestures like that smoothed over a lot of minor trench disputes. One of the stranger methods you've seen involves the famous Tommy cooker, a small portable stove issued with solid fuel tablets. In theory, it was perfect, self-contained, lightweight, and able to boil water in about 10 minutes. In practice, the fuel tablets often smoked like a chimney, and if the wind caught the flame, you'd be boiling water until your great-grandchildren enlisted. But the sight of half a dozen men crouched around their little cookers, shielding the flame with their bodies, was a kind of camaraderie in itself. There's a moment you recall clearly, a bombardment in the middle distance, the ground trembling underfoot, and a corporal crouched serenely over his Tommy cooker as though he were back in his kitchen at home. "They can shell all they like," he'd said without looking up. "But I'm not letting this water cool before I get my tea." You almost envied his priorities. Of course, improvisation could go to ridiculous extremes. One night, in the absence of any fuel, Sergeant Murray convinced half the platoon to donate spare candle stubs. He rigged them under a mess tin in a precarious little circle, the wax dripping down like some bizarre cake decoration. It took an hour and a half, but by the end, he had a rolling boil and the smug expression of a man who has proven a point no one asked him to prove. Historians still debate whether such persistence in the face of absurd conditions was a product of British stubbornness, military discipline, or sheer boredom. You suspect it was a bit of all three. But whatever the reason, men would go to ridiculous lengths for a proper brew, and the process of making it, however chaotic, was as much a morale boost as the drink itself. And so you learn that out here. Tea isn't just consumed, it's earned. One precarious flame and questionable water source at a time. By now you've learned that tea in the trenches is rarely just tea. It's an alchemy of whatever you can scrounge from the ration pile, whatever the supply train remembered to send, and whatever contraband your mates have managed to squirrel away. The official rations are predictable. The small packets of strong black tea, the brick-like sugar cubes, and, perhaps most beloved of all, tins of condensed milk. The tea itself is nothing fancy. No delicate Darjeeling or fragrant Earl Grey here. This is robust, almost aggressive, assam-heavy stuff that can stand up to being brewed in a battered mess tin over a candle stub. Too weak, and the men grumble it's barely water. Too strong, and someone will joke about using it to degrease a rifle. Either way, you drink it without fuss, because the alternative is no tea at all. The sugar comes in cubes so hard they could double as ammunition. You've seen men bash them against the trench wall just to break them down, sending sweet shards skittering into the mud. If the sugars run out, some will go without. Others will try pilfering from the cookhouse, and one memorable chap, Corporal Dunn, once attempted to sweeten his tea with a dab of jam from his bread ration. The result, to put it kindly, was memorable for all the wrong reasons. And then there's the condensed milk, the real prize of the ration pack. Thick, sticky, and sweet enough to make your teeth ache. It turns a sharp, tannic brew into something almost indulgent. Officially, it's meant to be shared among the section. But good luck enforcing that. You've caught men tipping the tin straight into their mouths like it's liquid gold. In quieter moments, someone might punch holes in both ends of the tin to pour it neatly. More often, they just stab it with a bayonet and let the thick ribbon of cream slide out in gurgling globs. Historians still argue whether the condensed milk was included for its nutritional value, calories and calcium in a convenient form, or simply because the army knew morale would suffer if soldiers had to drink tea black. Whatever the reason, its arrival in a fresh supply drop could cause more excitement than a delivery of extra ammunition. Of course, the rations didn't always arrive on time. Bad weather, enemy shelling, or logistical hiccups could leave you staring at an empty mess tin with a kind of existential despair. That's when barter came into play. A spare pair of socks might get you a handful of tea leaves. A tin of bully beef could be traded for a spoonful of sugar. The informal trench economy was alive and well, and tea was its currency. Some men experimented with stretching the tea when supplies ran low. Used leaves were dried on a bit of cloth and steeped again, producing a pale, watery brew that was more habit than pleasure. Others mixed the leaves with whatever herbs or plants they could forage, mint from a hedgerow, or, once, something unidentified that turned the tea bright green. The drinker claimed it was refreshing, though the rest of you suspected it was mildly toxic. Letters from home sometimes contained contraband luxuries, a small packet of loose-leaf tea from a favorite shop, or a tin of sugar lumps wrapped in brown paper. These were hoarded, brought out only on special occasions. Birthdays, Christmas, or after surviving a particularly hairy patrol. You'd brew it carefully, savor it slowly, and try not to think about how quickly it would be gone. One evening stands out in your memory. The rain had been relentless for 3 days, the trench walls oozing with mud. The fire was sulking rather than burning, and the tea leaves on hand were of the third-use variety. Then, like a minor miracle, Sergeant Whitfield produced a pristine tin of condensed milk from his pack. No one asked where he got it. No one cared. He opened it, poured a generous spoonful into each mug. And for the first time that week, you felt something close to comfort settle in your bones. It's strange how such humble ingredients, tea, sugar, milk, could become as essential to survival as boots or blankets. But in the damp, gray world of the trenches, these simple rations were proof that somewhere beyond the wire, the rituals of home still existed, waiting for you. You'd think that in the grim, sodden world of trench life, the only liquid a soldier might crave would be something stronger than tea. And you'd be right, at least in part. The British Army had long issued rum as a morale booster, a little nip in the morning to brace you for the day ahead, or in the evening to thaw the chill from your bones. But tea, surprisingly, became a rival for this role, sometimes even overtaking rum in its importance to the daily rhythm of life at the front. It wasn't an either-or situation. In fact, the two drinks often coexisted in a kind of strange camaraderie, rum for courage, tea for comfort. There were men who would swear by a tot of rum in their tea, creating a concoction with a burn to match the weather. Others kept them separate, believing each had its own sacred place in the ritual of survival. Historians still argue whether the tea served a purely practical function here, hydration, caffeine, warmth, or if it became a kind of quiet competition with alcohol for the title of best morale booster. The thing about rum was that it could be rationed tightly, and when the stores were low, it vanished entirely for weeks. Tea, however, could nearly always be made. Even if it was weak and brewed from reused leaves, it was democratic, shared, sipped slowly, and consumed multiple times a day without any raised eyebrows from commanding officers. You could drink it before a patrol without worrying about your aim, and it wouldn't leave you foggy when you needed to keep your wits sharp. And there was something else. Rum was a blunt instrument. One swallow, and you felt the heat flood your chest, a reminder that the world was temporarily tolerable. Tea, on the other hand, was a slow build, a gradual spread of warmth from hands to arms to spine. It demanded patience, and in a way, that patience was part of its magic. Sitting with a mug of tea meant sitting still, talking quietly, letting your heartbeat settle into a calmer rhythm. One cold morning, you remember a group of men huddled around a brazier, mugs in hand, swapping jokes that barely qualified as funny. A fresh rum ration had come through the night before, but most of them were still choosing tea. When you asked why, Private Mathers grinned and said, "Rum reminds me I'm here. Tea reminds me I'm still me." That stuck with you, of course. There were some unorthodox moments when the two worlds collided. A sergeant you knew, half rogue, half saint, used to make what he called trench punch. It was nothing more than army tea with an unhealthy splash of rum, a bit of sugar, and the occasional dash of powdered lemonade from a care package. The result was questionable. But on a miserable evening, with the wind slicing through the duckboards, it did the trick. There was also the subtle political edge to the tea versus rum debate. Commanders preferred tea because it kept soldiers steady and alert. Too much reliance on rum, and you risked dulled reflexes, poor judgment, or a warm glow in the middle of an artillery barrage. Not ideal. In that sense, the tea kit wasn't just a comfort. It was a tool of discipline, a way to keep men functioning at their best while still offering them something they looked forward to. In quieter moments, after the rum had been drunk and the mugs washed out, it was always tea that lingered. Tea by the brazier, tea during a lull in the firing, tea at midnight when the stars hung low and silent over no man's land. Rum could lift you for a moment, but tea kept you grounded, tethered to the ordinary human rituals that made life in the trenches bearable. And maybe that's why the tea kit became not just an issued item, but a treasured one. Rum might have fueled courage, but tea fueled the day-to-day endurance that actually kept you alive. In the British Army of the Second World War, tea was not a luxury. It was a listed item, given the same logistical priority as ammunition, fuel, and bandages. In official paperwork, It appeared under the ration tables as if it were a tactical necessity, which, in the minds of many soldiers and commanders, it was a standard tea kit. When issued, came in a compact, weatherproof canvas roll, about the size of a modern tool bag. Inside, there was usually a small kettle or billy can, a couple of dented enamel mugs, a tin for loose tea leaves, and sometimes a cloth pouch containing sugar and a can of condensed milk. The milk was sweet and thick, so viscous that in winter it sometimes had to be scooped out with a spoon rather than poured. A folding stove, often a simple sheet metal contraption that burned solid fuel tablets, completed the set. The canvas roll was not glamorous. It smelled faintly of damp fabric and scorched metal, and its straps often stiffened with mud and dried tea stains. But in the field, opening that roll meant something comforting, the possibility of hot, sweet liquid in the belly, no matter the cold, the rain, or the hour. Commanders understood the morale value of tea so well that official manuals advised scheduling breaks for brewing whenever possible. In some regiments, it became almost ceremonial. The tea kit unpacked with care, water fetched, fire kindled, mugs passed around, even in the middle of a mobile operation. There was a rhythm: halt, brew, sip, move. And while soldiers were grateful for the official issue, many quietly modified their kits. Some replaced the folding stove with a sturdier homemade one. Others carried a larger mug to avoid the indignity of too small rations. There were even cases of men swapping rations, tinned meat for extra sugar, just to improve their brew. It was a small ritual wrapped in khaki canvas. Yet in those moments between marches and battles, the official tea kit was not just equipment. It was, for a few steaming minutes, a reminder of home. In the British military mindset of the Second World War, tea was more than a morale booster. It was a kind of battlefield medicine. Official medical officers sometimes recommended it for shock, exposure, and even mild dysentery. This wasn't entirely unfounded. Hot liquid in the body helped restore warmth. The caffeine offered a lift to flagging alertness, and the sugar provided quick, easily absorbed energy. When men staggered back from a night patrol, shivering and pale, the first order was often not, "Get them to the medics," but "Get the kettle on." A steaming mug pressed into cold hands could bring color back to the face and a degree of steadiness to shaking fingers. In Arctic convoys or high-altitude posts, where frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats, tea acted as a psychological line of defense against despair as much as against the cold. Medical kits sometimes contained tea in the form of concentrated tablets or pre-mixed powdered blends, designed for quick preparation in the field. These weren't for taste. They were harsh, slightly bitter, and mixed into whatever water was available. But they did the job. Soldiers joked that they tasted like the inside of a first aid tin. Yet no one refused them when the alternative was numbness and exhaustion. Even in hospitals, tea was a near-constant companion. Convalescing troops sipped it between dressing changes, the steam curling in the air above stiff white sheets. In field dressing stations, orderlies would move down the rows with a dented kettle, pouring into chipped enamel cups while murmuring encouragement. It didn't cure infections or close wounds, but tea offered something that morphine, bandages, and antiseptics could not. A familiar taste and a reminder of ordinary life, served in a war that had stripped so much away. There are countless wartime recollections where tea was brewed not in the safety of a barracks, but under the thump and whistle of incoming fire. Soldiers became expert at reading the rhythm of combat. If the guns paused for even a minute, someone would be crouched over a small stove or an upturned ammo box with a mess tin balanced precariously on top. In North Africa, crews boiled water beside their tanks, the heat from the engines helping the kettles along. In Italy, Infantrymen on mountain slopes scraped together enough twigs and dry grass to light a tiny flame. The smoke curling away before the next artillery shell landed, even during the chaos of the Normandy landings. British and Canadian troops tell of finding a lull on the beach, setting up makeshift burners from ration tins, and passing enamel mugs hand to hand. It was rarely perfect tea. Often the water was gritty, tinged with fuel residue, or flavored with whatever container had been used last. But that hardly mattered. The ritual itself was the point. In the middle of destruction, brewing tea was a small act of defiance, a way of saying, "We're still here. We're still ourselves." There are stories of soldiers being scolded for lighting up a fire too close to the front, the glow a beacon for snipers. Yet just as often, officers looked the other way, knowing what that cup meant for morale. A sip of hot tea could steady a trigger finger, soften the edge of fear, and restore the quiet courage needed to carry on. In a war measured in grand strategies and vast casualty lists, these moments, kneeling over a mess tin while shells cracked in the distance, were victories of a smaller kind, but no less important to the men who fought. At the height of the Second World War, tea was as tightly controlled as petrol or sugar. In Britain, the government fixed the civilian allowance at 2 ounces per person per week, barely enough for 1 cup a day if carefully measured. Every household received their tea via ration books, each coupon torn out by the grocer, and the supply strictly accounted for. On the home front, it meant a constant dance between thrift and craving. People learned to stretch their leaves, brewing a pot in the morning, then topping it up with hot water throughout the day until the flavor was more suggestion than substance. Some boiled the leaves twice, wringing out every trace of tannin. Others hoarded their allowance for special occasions, birthdays, a letter from a loved one, or simply a gray, drizzly afternoon when only a proper cup would do. But where there is scarcity, there is also ingenuity and a shadow economy. The wartime black market for tea was brisk and discreet. Dock workers sometimes siphoned off small sacks from incoming shipments. Couriers slipped packets under coats, delivering them to cafes willing to pay triple the ration price. In rural areas, neighbors whispered to one another about a friend who knows someone at the depot, and swapped jars of jam or extra eggs for a precious quarter-pound of contraband leaves. Fake tea also appeared, dubious blends padded with dried blackberry leaves, roasted chicory, or even crushed grass. Most drinkers could tell immediately, but when the craving was strong enough, even the worst imitation could find a taker. Despite the restrictions, the British Ministry of Food ensured that tea was one of the last comforts to be rationed into oblivion. They knew the war could not be fought on morale alone, but it certainly could not be fought without it. A single steaming mug, whether obtained legally or through quiet back-channel deals, was enough to remind a nation of what it was fighting to preserve. For sailors in the Royal Navy, tea was more than a drink. It was an anchor of routine amid the chaos of war. Life aboard ship was governed by bells and watches, but nothing was so dependable as the mid-morning stand easy and the late afternoon brew. The ocean could be raging, the air thick with diesel and cordite. But when the call went out for char, men lined up with their enamel mugs as if answering a sacred summons. Brewing tea at sea, however, was a challenge. The ship's galley had to prepare it in huge urns, and the results varied wildly. On good days, it was strong and bracing, the color of freshly polished brass. On bad days, it was thin, lukewarm, and tasted faintly of the metal pots in which it had been boiled. Still, few complained. Hot tea was hot tea. Merchant Navy crews, who risked U-boat attacks while hauling vital supplies, clung to their own tea rituals. Captains often kept a private stash of quality leaves, reserved for morale-boosting moments, after surviving a storm, after delivering a cargo intact, or when the horizon finally showed the welcome outline of home. Tea also served as a social glue at sea. In cramped mess rooms and cabins, it bridged ranks and backgrounds. A petty officer might share a biscuit and a brew with an engine room hand, and for a few minutes, hierarchy dissolved in the steam rising from their mugs. Even in battle, tea found a way to appear. Stories circulated of sailors putting a kettle on the moment the guns fell silent, the smell of boiling water mingling with the scent of gunpowder. To a man far from home, surrounded by salt water and uncertainty, that simple cup was proof that some comforts could survive the war. For the men of the Royal Navy, tea was not merely a beverage, it was a daily ritual, a lifeline, and a small act of normalcy in the middle of a war fought on restless waters. Every ship, from sleek destroyers to massive battleships, had its own rhythm, but none of them dared skip the mid-morning stand easy or the late afternoon tea break. No matter if the North Atlantic swelled with icy waves or the Mediterranean sun scorched the deck, when the kettle went on, life briefly paused. The preparation was both an art and a hazard. In the galley, sailors brewed tea in massive urns that sloshed with the ship's movement, each one big enough to serve dozens at a time. The taste varied wildly, sometimes strong and sharp as a fresh copper penny, other times thin and bitter, carrying the faint tang of seawater or the metallic bite of its container. But at sea, hot tea was hot tea, and few dared turn it down. Merchant Navy crews, braving U-boat patrols to keep supply lines open, also guarded their tea rituals fiercely. Captains often carried a secret stash of high-quality leaves, brought out only on special occasions. After a storm passed, a cargo was delivered intact, or the first glimpse of a home port appeared on the horizon. Tea had the rare power to dissolve naval hierarchy. In the cramped mess rooms, an officer might sit elbow to elbow with a deckhand, sharing biscuits and pouring from the same battered pot. For a few minutes, there were no ranks, just sailors, mugs in hand, watching the horizon together. Even in the aftermath of battle, tea made its appearance. There are stories of crews putting a kettle on moments after the guns fell silent, the smell of boiling water mixing with the acrid smoke of cordite, to men adrift in the vast uncertainty of the ocean. That steaming mug was more than a drink. It was proof that a fragment of home had survived the war with them. In the baking expanse of the North African desert, where the sun bleached the world into shades of gold and bone, tea became both a survival tool and a stubborn statement of identity. For the British 8th Army, nicknamed the Desert Rats, a hot cup of tea was as essential as water, petrol, or ammunition. The heat might shimmer above the dunes at well over 40 degrees, yet soldiers would still crouch beside a tiny stove, coaxing flames from scraps of fuel just to boil their precious brew. The challenge began with the water. Wells and supply trucks rarely offered anything pure. Most of the time, the water was warm, brackish, and tinged with the earthy taste of sand. But tea could mask that unpleasant flavor, transforming foul water into something at least drinkable. In fact, the Army's official desert ration packs included strong tea, plenty of sugar, and condensed milk, not merely for morale, but because it encouraged men to drink more fluids in a climate where dehydration killed silently. Fuel was another problem. In the open desert, there was little wood, so soldiers improvised with anything that would burn: petrol-soaked sand, old crates, even dried camel dung. Petrol stoves were particularly risky. One careless match could turn the whole camp into an inferno. Yet men would take that risk daily, their tin mugs lined up like sentries, waiting to be filled. Tea also carried a strange magic in the desert war. It was the pause between shell bursts, the anchor in the chaos of a tank battle. There are accounts of both British and Commonwealth troops brewing tea in the shade of their armored vehicles while tracer fire cut across the horizon, as though daring the war to interrupt their ritual. For the enemy, this habit was baffling. German soldiers reportedly marveled at how the British would halt operations, mid-march or mid-battle, just to brew a pot. Rommel himself is said to have admired it, not the drink itself, but the discipline, the unshakable composure it symbolized. In the desert, where the land could swallow a man whole and the war could change in an hour, tea was proof of something enduring. It wasn't just hot water and leaves. It was the taste of home, defying the sun and the sand. Behind the tidy maps and grand speeches of the Second World War lay a shadowy world of whispered passwords, false papers, and dangerous journeys through occupied territory. In that world, tea, ordinary, unassuming tea, could be both a deadly trap and a secret signal for spies, resistance fighters, and undercover operatives. Tea was more than a drink, it was a test. In occupied France, a misplaced tea habit could expose a British agent instantly. The British brewed strong black tea with milk, but many French cafes served it weak, without milk or with lemon. A newcomer asking for tea with milk in the wrong village could invite suspicion. German counterintelligence knew these small cultural quirks, and they watched for them. The Special Operations Executive, SOE, briefed its agents on such details before parachuting them into enemy territory. They learned to drink coffee instead of tea, to accept it without milk, and to avoid any sign of British table manners. In one case, an SOE courier was nearly caught in Paris after asking for tea at a small bistro, something locals rarely did. She saved herself only by laughing it off as a silly British craving and quickly switching to wine. In the occupied Netherlands, tea sometimes acted as a covert signal. Resistance members arranged meetings by inviting each other for afternoon tea, which meant gathering at a safe house. The tea itself might be nothing more than weak herbal brew made from dried leaves or berry twigs. Real tea was rare under rationing, but the words carried their own meaning. A chipped teapot on a windowsill could mark the location of an underground printing press. For the enemy, tea also played its part. German officers in occupied territories often accepted tea as a sign of civility from collaborators or informants. That meant a poisoned pot, if carefully planned, could become an assassination tool, though such operations were rare and incredibly risky. More often, tea offered cover for coded conversations. A resistance leader might chat with a local shopkeeper over tea while slipping microfilm into a sugar tin. The irony was that tea, a symbol of comfort and civility, could also be a cloak for deceit. In the murky space between loyalty and betrayal, the clink of a teaspoon might be as dangerous as the click of a pistol's safety. In the prisoner of war camps of the Second World War, tea was more than just a beverage. It was currency, comfort, and sometimes even a quiet act of defiance. Whether you were a captured British airman in Germany or an Allied soldier held in a Japanese camp, the arrival of tea could transform a grim day into a moment of humanity. In German-run POW camps like Stalag Luft-Thurl, British prisoners clung to tea as part of their identity. Red Cross parcels, when they arrived intact, often contained small packets of loose-leaf tea or tea bags. Guards sometimes allowed these deliveries, partly because they saw tea as harmless, and partly because it kept prisoners calmer. Men would gather in their huts, fashioning makeshift teapots from tin cans, straining the brew through scraps of cloth. Even in captivity, they observed the ritual, boiling the water, letting the leaves steep, and sharing the drink before tackling whatever work or escape planning lay ahead. Tea in these camps became a barter item with its own value. A single packet could be traded for soap, extra bread, or a pair of warm socks. In some cases, Prisoners used tea to bribe guards for small favors, like extra writing paper or news from home. The Germans, aware of tea's power, occasionally withheld it as a form of punishment. In Japanese POW camps, the story was harsher. Supplies were scarce, and when tea was available, it was usually a thin brew made from roasted barley, rice husks, or whatever leaves could be scavenged. Still, the act of sitting together and drinking from battered cups gave prisoners a sense of solidarity. It was a reminder that they were still human beings in a place designed to break them. For some, the tea ritual became a quiet form of resistance. By preserving this one small comfort from civilian life, they refused to let captivity erase their dignity. Sharing tea meant sharing strength, and sometimes that was enough to get through another day. Beneath the streets of London, in the dimly lit Churchill war rooms, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the clack of typewriters, and the faint, familiar scent of brewing tea. Down here, far from the bombs falling above, Britain's wartime leadership plotted the course of the Second World War, and tea was as constant as the maps on the walls. For Winston Churchill, tea was not a mere refreshment. It was a strategic asset, part of the rhythm that kept his inner circle functioning through endless nights of planning and crisis. Secretaries worked in rotating shifts, and each new arrival often carried a fresh tray of tea, strong, steaming, and served with milk. Ministers drank it between heated debates over troop movements. Military planners sipped it while poring over reconnaissance photographs. In these cramped rooms, tea breaks weren't a pause in the work. They were the work, moments to gather thoughts before returning to the war table. The war rooms ran on urgency, but tea enforced a kind of quiet order. It allowed tempers to cool when arguments threatened to overheat. Churchill himself preferred a more robust cup, sometimes accompanied by biscuits or a sandwich, and was known to keep tea service available at all hours. Staff joked that tea was the second fuel of the British war effort, after coal. Even in the most tense moments, when reports came in of U-boat sinkings or losses in North Africa, the sound of teacups clinking was a reminder of home, of something worth fighting for. The drink was a link between the underground nerve center and the millions of Britons enduring the blitz above. In the war rooms, tea was more than a drink. It was a binding agent, holding together a government under siege. Without it, the long nights might have broken morale. With it, even the darkest hours felt a little lighter. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, tea was waiting. Across Britain, from bomb-scarred London streets to quiet village greens, the kettles boiled as though the nation had been holding its breath for 6 long years and could finally exhale in steam. In Trafalgar Square, amid the jubilant crowds waving Union Jacks, tea vendors handed out free cups to strangers who hugged like old friends. Railway stations saw porters pouring from tin pots into chipped enamel mugs for soldiers stepping off trains, home at last. Families who had gone without sugar for years now stirred in a precious spoonful, the sweetness almost overwhelming in its rarity. Churchill himself marked victory with speeches, cigars, and, of course, a strong cup, declaring that Britain had not only fought on the beaches, in the air, and on the seas, but also in the kitchens and tea shops, where morale was fortified one brew at a time. Newspapers ran photographs of smiling women pouring tea for returning troops, captions calling it the taste of peace. In bombed-out neighborhoods, tea parties sprang up among the rubble. A table might be missing a leg, a chair might be borrowed from 3 houses down, but the cups were full. It was a simple, universal language. We survived. We are together. We will rebuild. For a war that had stretched across continents and touched every life, it was fitting that Britain's victory was toasted not with champagne in gilded halls, but with tea in battered mugs, steam curling upward like the first quiet promise of a better tomorrow. And so, the war ended not only with parades and treaties, but with the quiet clink of spoons against porcelain. In the soft light of a kitchen lamp, steam rose from a teacup like a sigh of relief, carrying with it the unspoken truth that life, even after great hardship, has a way of warming itself back to kindness. As you drift toward sleep tonight, think of that small comfort, the way a humble cup of tea could steady a weary hand, lift a tired heart, and remind an entire nation that peace was possible. May your dreams be gentle, your rest deep, and your own kettle always ready to greet you in the morning. Good night, and sleep well.